Hello, everyone. Welcome again to another video lecture for Module 13, where we're once again focusing on food justice. What I want to do now is to explore how two of the chapters from Pollan's book, In Defense of Food, specifically Chapter 3, Nutritionism Comes to Market, and Chapter 4, Food Science's Golden Age. I want to spend a little bit of time here and think about these chapters and how they actually provide, I think, a strong foundation for Kant's critique of various capitalistic practices that we saw in the previous video. So essentially, by paying close attention and looking carefully at how Pollan describes the kind of transformations of food into nutrition, a kind of nutrition delivery system, and how food science really became intertwined with various corporate marketing strategies, I think this will help us see how those developments undermine rational autonomy in various ways that I think Kant would consider morally problematic, to say the least. Again, I should say this is my interpretation of Kant on the principle of justice, but I do think that there are ways to support this interpretation. So let's begin then with chapter 3 from Pollan. Nutritionism comes to market. So Pollan's point in this chapter is when we go back to the 1970s, and then this becomes even more accelerated through the 1980s and 90s, the American food industry seems to have adopted the idea that food is best understood not as whole foods, where we recognize these things as vegetables and grains or meats and fruits. Rather, the food industry started collectively thinking of food as merely in terms of nutrients. Right? This is the approach that Pollan has been discussing throughout the book quite a bit, what he describes as nutritionism. So this shift, it wasn't driven by consumers who wanted to think of food as these invisible nutrients. Rather, this shift in the way the food industry was approaching how we are conceiving of food was essentially driven by some sort of a convergence of political as well as economic and scientific pressures. So the federal government at that time wanted to address various noticeable rises in the rate of things like heart disease and other similar sorts of health concerns. And so nutritionists wanted to assert the kind of scientific authority that they felt they held. And then food companies wanted to make money, right? Again, we live in a capitalist society, so that was clearly their goal. So the idea then was we could combine these things, these different goals, if you will, in order to sell products in a crowded marketplace. Together with these forces, what we got was the creation of what the kind of ideology of what Pollan calls nutritionism. Now, notice that what made nutritionism so convenient for corporations was the fact that these nutrients were invisible. Right? You can't see saturated fats or antioxidants. You can't see omega-3 fatty acids in some product, right? So you have to rely upon whatever the package actually tells you. And this kind of invisibility created an enormous amount of opportunity for companies to really shape the consumer's understanding of what they were eating. Right? So food labels could highlight certain nutrients while quietly ignoring others. Indeed, we saw this when we considered Plakius' account of the epistemology of food. This is something we considered at the beginning of the semester. So products could be essentially reformulated, chemically speaking, to fit whatever nutrients was fashionable at that particular time. And because nutrients often change their sort of moral status, at one point fat is bad, and then in another decade fat becomes good. Well, companies could constantly update the products and thereby create basically a perpetual cycle of so-called new and improved versions of whatever foods that were often nutritionally worse than what they were replacing. So Pollan points out a classic example of margarine versus butter, or how low-fat versions of various foods that turned out to be very high in sugars. And the key point here is that nutritionism turned food into something that could be manipulated and marketed according to whatever nutrient trends happen to be going on at the time. Indeed, we still see this quite a bit today. It's all over the place. The result here was the creation of a kind of an environment in which the appearance of healthiness that mattered much more than whatever actual nutritional value was in the food. And this meant that consumers were told to just simply trust the claims on the box, rather than any of your own wisdom that might be passed down from generation to generation. So then this brings us directly to chapter 4, Food Science's Golden Age, where Pollan describes how once nutritionism really took hold, food science entered into what he calls its golden age of innovation. But notice that this so-called golden age, well, it wasn't golden in the sense where, the food industry was now producing healthier and more transparent food. Rather, it represents a golden age for the industry's ability to engineer foods that could satisfy whatever the latest nutritional theories happen to be on the trend, while at the same time satisfying the needs of large-scale industrial production. So then food scientists began to think of food in terms of their component parts, things like proteins, sugars, fats, fibers, and so forth. And then recombine those parts into things like shelvable and stable and highly processed products, things that wouldn't go bad if they sat around for a while. And Paulin explains in this chapter that this was the era in which we saw the rise of so-called engineered foods, things like low-fat yogurts or fiber-enriched breakfast cereals or vitamin-fortified sugary drinks and snack foods that were advertised as a heart-healthy, alternative to something else. And it's in this way then that these new products were able to conform to various narrowly defined governmental nutritional recommendations and therefore get the label of healthy or whatever. And many of these foods did not even exist in nature themselves, right? They were the industrial creations assembled from isolated and additives and preservatives, stabilizers, and synthetic nutrients. Pollan also describes and emphasizes the point that food science during this period was deeply entwined with marketing itself, right? So the so-called science that we're thinking of, the science behind these creations, well, they were science that was created by the food industry, right? The science behind this relied upon preliminary or very speculative findings. For example, early studies on beta carotene suggested that it might prevent cancer. In fact, I remember hearing this from my mom all the time growing up. Eat your carrots and it'll prevent cancer. So what happened was companies in the food industry immediately started fortifying various foods with isolated beta carotene. Later on, research ended up showing that isolated beta carotene supplements actually increased cancer risk in some populations. So this is another sort of example, I think a very powerful example of how selective scientific findings were used by the food industry to sell products before the science was itself actually settled. So then what's the problem here? I think as Pollan describes it, the problem isn't just that science was incomplete, right? Science is always, in some sense, incomplete insofar as we want to allow for science to be changed. Whatever our best scientific theory is now, it should be open to the possibility that future research could force us to rethink or reevaluate just different aspects of our current best theories. But I think the problem instead is that consumers were led to believe that these engineered foods were, in some sense, scientifically superior to traditional whole foods, right? The authority of science was, in some sense, borrowed, if you will, or even hijacked in order to give credibility to the products whose nutritional value was questionable at best. And then food labels with various health claims and governmental approval of various nutritional guidelines. These all contributed to a kind of an environment in which consumers, what else are they going to do? I mean, they're supposed to, I guess, just believe or trust, have faith in what the labels say. Well, so consumers were sort of just left in a position where that's all they could do. They believed that they were making the rational, in fact, scientifically informed choice. So they thought they were doing the right thing. When in fact, it turns out that the information that they were relying upon had been filtered or, in some sense, curated and manipulated by the very companies that were profiting off of the consumers' confusions. So now, with all of that in mind, with regard to the food industry and the development of these so-called low fat or nutritionally valuable foods, government approved, scientifically informed, right? With regard to all of this, as Pollan describes it in chapter 3 and 4, I want to now connect this to what we talked about previously with regard to Kantian deontology. Remember that for Kant, morality is built on the idea that rational beings like you and me deserve respect, right? We need to make sure that we're always treating rational agents as rational agents, right? We can't treat a rational agent as a mere means to our own ends. Rather, we need to respect their rational agency whenever we're engaging with them. And so, to respect someone, according to Kant, is to treat them as an end in themselves and never as a means to an end, never as a tool or an object to be used. And this requires that we avoid manipulating them, we avoid deceiving them, or undermining their ability to make a rational choice for themselves. Right. So the very moment that we distort the information in order to influence someone's behavior, and then at that moment, we're treating that person, that rational agent, as a means to our own end, or as a tool or an object to be used, as a kind of resource to be exploited for profit or financial gain, which is exactly what takes place in these sorts of situations. Going back all the way to the 1970s, with regard to the food industry, especially in the United States and our capitalistic society. So let me give you a couple of concrete examples that I hope will illustrate this point about how Kant is thinking about rational agency here. So, for instance, suppose that you invited a friend on a road trip, but you also intentionally failed to tell them that your car's brakes needed work and that your car's brakes frequently fail. Because if you had told your friend this, then you know that your friend would have chosen not to come with you on this road trip. So in that situation, it looks like you would be using your friend merely as a means to get what you want. Your friend's ability to rationally assess the risks seem to be blocked in some sense because you are withholding information that they needed and was essential in order for them to make a decision for themselves. Or consider another kind of example. Consider like a medical case. Suppose that if a doctor tells a patient only the benefits of some procedure but intentionally omits the major risks that are involved, well, then it looks like the patient's consent is not fully informed and not fully rational or fully autonomous. And so, in both of these kinds of cases, it looks like the person is deprived of the information that they need to make a decision for themselves, to be somebody who is self-governed or determining their own course of their life according to their own reason and rationality, which is precisely what Kant says we must never do. So when we read Pollan through this kind of Kantian perspective, the moral problem becomes, I think, quite clear. Right, the practice Pollan describes, where we're thinking of nutrient-based marketing or selective disclosure, reliance upon invisible nutrient claims, and the appropriation of various scientific language. All of these seem to be forms of deception, really importantly, clear forms of deception. Even if no individual statement on the package is strictly false, the overall effect is simply to mislead you, right? Because the goal is to get you to buy the product, even if you have no idea what exactly you're purchasing. And consumers are encouraged to believe that they are acting on various scientific claims or scientific knowledge, when in reality they're acting on the selective presentation of information that's crafted by various corporations to maximize their bottom line, right? I mean, the goal in a capitalist society is not the benefit of the consumer, rather is the benefit of the shareholders. The only moral obligation that these corporations have is to maximize profit for shareholders. That's the moral obligation that they're concerned with. So then, this is precisely the kind of manipulation that Kant condemns. According to Kant, the autonomy of a rational agent, a rational being like you or myself, must never be undermined. If a person cannot make a rational choice because the information that they need is in some sense obscured, or their rational agency, their rational autonomy has been violated in some sense, well, if a company's business model depends upon presenting information in this way, then the consumer becomes confused or misled. Well, it seems like the company is using the consumer, right? They're using the consumer to make a profit. So, according to Kant's approach, this kind of deontological way of thinking about the food industry, this should really never be allowed. It doesn't matter that the market rewards these practices. It shouldn't matter that they are legal or maybe even common. Deception and manipulation, according to the categorical imperative and what Kant says here, these things are always wrong. And so we have a moral duty to resist these sorts of practices, to resist relying upon them in our daily lives. So, therefore, according to Pollan's account of the food industry, especially in these two chapters here, what becomes clear is that it looks like the food industry is a kind of rich source of evidence for a Kantian critique of these capitalistic practices. Pollan, I think, shows us that the market incentives that companies have to obscure information, to simply to claim that something is scientific and so forth, even though the science may not be settled, or to keep consumers sufficiently confused so that they are dependent upon the nutrient claims rather than their own judgment. All of these things seem to be at work in these chapters here. And again, I think Kant shows us why these practices are morally unacceptable. So when we bring together what Pollan says and in defense of food, as well as what we reflect upon in the last couple of videos about Kant's approach to hunger and poverty and famine relief, especially as it relates to our duty to justice. When we bring these things together, we can see that as rational agents, we have a genuine moral obligation, I think, to withdraw or to withhold our own support from these companies and systems that rely upon deception as a kind of a core component of their operations. So this is something I want you to think about as you're answering the questions for the module this week.